Hello, neuroscience students. This is going to be our second lecture online, and we're moving into chapter 14. I'm hoping that you're all doing well and hopefully getting adjusted to this new reality that we have to live in. I want to say a couple words. Take care of yourself, take care of your loved ones, obviously, and also what you're going to have to do is really take control of your learning, and not just in this course, in every course that you're taking. I know it requires a lot of work. I can see that my kids who are home right now, they all have to do it by themselves, pretty much, and it's a lot of work. So I really admire you all, because you will have to put in a lot of work, but you will finish strong. So let's talk about some neuroscience of the control of movement. We talked about the reflexes and proprioceptors, so sort of the lowest levels of controls. We also talked about reflexes, and this was all the controls of the spinal cord and the execution of movement. Now we're going to talk about the upper level controls, if you will. So let's just talk about the hierarchy of motor control. What does the brain do to the motor activity? Well, obviously, we can immediately say, well, it makes us produce voluntary movements, the measured movements, the learned movements, the very precise movements of our fingers, of our mouth, of our voice, of our throat and vocal cords, allowing us to articulate speech, and so on and so forth. So all of those are voluntary and well thought through movements, most of them at least are. So what's the hierarchy here? We have the highest level, which would be strategy. That means preparation for movement. Let's think about what we need to do to move. Let's mobilize the right muscles. At this highest level, it isn't just about which muscles are going to move, which parts of the body are going to be where in space. It is also about, excuse me, which muscles have to be inhibited, which movements have to be prevented. Then there is the middle level, the tactics of the movement, and finally the lowest level, which is the execution. So let's just go and move the muscles. The system uses sensory information from a lot of different sensory neurons, so all the proprioceptors, but remember that in the movement of our body, we're also using the sensory information coming in through our audio vestibular nerve, in particular our vestibular apparatus, especially when we talk about keeping our posture, moving against the gravity of the anti-gravity reflexes, remaining balanced while moving, keeping our head in a fixed position as the rest of our body moves. So there is visual information, there is auditory information, and then there is the proprioceptive information, and also sometimes the touch receptors are involved, of course. Now, if we look at the actual breakdown of the systems, looking from down towards the top control, first we have the spinal tracts, descending spinal tracts. Those will terminate at motor neurons and they will execute the movements themselves. A little bit higher than that, we have the motor cortex and the regions that are associated with it, and the basal ganglia. So we're going to discuss all of those regions and what they do in particular, how they influence movements. Let's look at a little bit about the spinal tracts. What do we mean by spinal tracts? Well, when we look at the cross-section of the spinal cord, which you're pretty familiar with by now, you can see that there are regions that are lateral, so that means on the sides, and then there are the medial, or in this case, since this is the ventral surface, those are going to be called ventromedial. This is where the names of the pathways are coming from the location that they occupy in the spinal cord. So recall now that in the spinal cord, the gray matter is on the inside, the white matter is on the outside for the most part. That means that these tracks are going to be made up of white matter, meaning axons, a lot of axons running down together in bundles. So we have the lateral pathways and we have the ventromedial pathways. Here is the picture of these same pathways, but at their origin. This is where these pathways come from. They are coming from the brain and they're descending, and from the brain stem, and they're descending down the various regions of the spinal cord. So the major massive projection is coming from the corticospinal pathway. It is major and it is massive. If you recall, if you were to guess actually what is in this part of the cortex, I think a lot of you would immediately say, well, this is where the M1 or the motor cortex strip is. This is also very close to the somatosensory strip, and you would absolutely be right. This is where these where these neurons are actually originating from. So this corticospinal pathway, if we go right back here, this is going to be that major blue dot within the lateral column of the spinal cord. And then you can see here there's a little bit smaller bundle called the rubrospinal tract. The rubrospinal tract begins at the red nucleus. This is which is in the brainstem here, right under the tectum. And the rubrospinal pathway tract gets its name from the rubro, which means rubra, I think actually in Latin means red. So if you section this part of the brain and look at the very fresh section, unstained, it's actually this nucleus appears red. That's where the name is coming from. The corticospinal and rubrospinal pathways, they actually have a similar function. They control the voluntary movement of distant muscles. So this is the major pathway, voluntary movement pathway that will decide how to execute the movement in the motor cortex and actually will send the message down. So let's look a little bit where it goes through. So if we have neurons originating at the motor cortex, crossing, actually coming down into the cerebral peduncles. And then, if you remember when we dissected the brain and you flipped the brain over and then you looked at the medulla contained these two really thick tracts on the bottom, the medullary pyramids, they were known. So these pyramids are actually the corticospinal tract axons running down the brainstem. So you would see them right here, making these really this white thickening on the pons. So this would be the pons area with the medullary pyramids right here. And then this track will decussate at the pyramids, so it will cross over to the other side of the spinal cord, which basically means that the left side of the brain will control the vast majority of the movement of the distal and proximal muscles that's in the periphery. All that voluntary movement that originates in the cortex, this is actually what, if we have an injury that damages any path of this corticospinal tract. This is something that we would see in people who are affected by a stroke. Sometimes the manifestation of the damage will be that they will have a one-sided paralysis of their body. Now, and this is due to the damage of the major corticospinal tract, also known as the pyramidal tract. Now, notice here the rubrospinal tract. In the humans, the rubrospinal tract is actually quite reduced compared to other mammals, where it is much more prominent. So, if there is a deficit in the corticospinal tract because of a lesion, because of a stroke, a damage that has happened, eventually the rubrospinal tract can gradually take over, and it can compensate for what was lost in the corticospinal tract. Is it going to be a complete recovery? No. Some things will not recover. For example, what will not recover is fine motor movements of fingers. So the subject might be able to grasp, but they can no longer grasp with 2 fingers. They're going to grasp with the entire hand. They have lost the ability to move their fingers independently. If then there is another lesion in experimental animal, for example, induced in the rubrospinal pathway, the recovery is gone and the subject is going to be paralyzed again. So that means that these 2 pathways, they can in some way actually substitute for one another. They can take over, not entirely, but to quite a large degree. Now, the ventromedial pathways, so if we look at the cross-section of the brain, this is the ventral and the medial is close to the midline. The ventromedial pathways are involved in balance and posture, so not just coordinating the simply movement of muscles, contraction of muscles, but actually balancing the entire body. So these originate in the brainstem. Let's look back at this picture here. So these would be the green pathways that you see here. Tectospinal, vestibulospinal, reticulospinal, right here. They're indicated in green. So these begin in the brainstem, not in the motor cortex. The vestibulospinal tracts, which you can see right here, and there are 2 of them, they are responsible for balancing the head, turning the head, and this is also the pathway that integrates inputs from the vestibular labyrinth. Remember, this is part of the inner ear, and this is our system of balance. So this makes us turn. When we hear a siren, makes our head turn towards the direction where the stimulus is coming from, or a flash of light, and that's going to attract our attention and turn our head immediately. The tectospinal tract, which is right here, and again we have 2 of them on both sides. This is getting response from the superior colliculus. Now, if you recall back, the superior colliculus, this is has to do with our visual cortex. So this superior colliculus gets direct input from the retina. Some of the retinal ganglions terminate and synapse in the superior colliculus, and then it also gets a secondary input from the visual cortex after from the axons that are coming through the lateral geniculate all the way to the visual cortex, and then that information goes back into the superior colliculus. So that would be information that has already been processed. Where do these pathways actually project to? They project to cervical areas, so the neck, upper torso, and the shoulders, all the areas involved in the balance and control of our posture. So here is a cross-section of these, and you can actually see here that this one is particularly nice, the superior collicular pathway. There we go. Tectorial crosses over and right here, and then here we have it terminating. This is the tectospinal tract, and similarly the vestibulospinal tract is also going to decussate in the medulla and then continue down. The ventromedial pathways, if we continue further, we have neurons that are originating from the pons, so these are called pontine reticular formation. Again, if we go back and look here, I think actually that would be these pontine nuclei right here. And so these would be responsible for the anti-gravity reflexes. So those would be things that we do to prevent ourselves falling. So let's look at a summary of these pathways to keep it all together and organized. Coming down from the motor cortex, which is part of the cerebral cortex, we have the pathways that come down to the spinal cord, and then we have the lateral pathways, which consist of the major one, the corticospinal pathway, and the rubrospinal pathway, the red nucleus pathway. So those will be controlling movement of muscles, and then the ventromedial pathways that are providing for control of balance and anti-gravity reflexes, so a little bit more complex responses.